So what are we going to cover in this session? We're going to look at how do we create learning environments that are safer and more inclusive for all of our learners. And I chose to change the wording a little bit from what I was given, rather than to say safe and inclusive, because we can't guarantee a fully safe or fully inclusive learning environment. What's safe for one individual is not for another. And also sometimes we do want to push students to a point of some discomfort with certain conversations. Some conversations are not comfortable. And so I changed the wording to say safer. So in this interactive session, we're going to discuss first how we can provide opportunities for students to reflect on their values, biases, and privilege. Reflect ourselves on the equity, accessibility, and inclusiveness of the learning environments that we find ourselves in. And then the main focus will be on strategies. How do we apply strategies to ensure that the learning environment we create is as equitable, accessible, and inclusive as possible? And so our agenda covers firstly bias and privilege. We talked about that last week, and you'll be happy to know I figured out the problem with the video, so you'll be able to hear them. Secondly, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in the learning environment. And then thirdly, the strategies to improve equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And as last week, I do have a list of resources for you at the end. So I wanted to start by talking about examining our own privilege as instructors, because by starting with examining where we come from in our own social location, that's a step towards helping our students start to examine their own privilege and social location. And this is a video that you could, if you wish, use with your students. I've used this with my students for them to start to reflect on their own privilege. So this is Dr. Michael Kimmel, who's a sociologist, and I'm going to start the video partway through. And you can let me know if you can hear the video. I'm going to put the closed captioning on.
Let's have a study group.
Were you able to hear that?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. And so I'm not playing you the whole clip. So in this talk, Dr. Kimmel is talking about when he was a graduate student in women's studies at the time, and a bunch of his colleagues who were also graduate students decided that they were going to have a study group. So we'll start there.
Get together once a week. We'll read a text. We'll talk about it. We'll have a potluck. So each week, 11 women and me got together. We would read some text in feminist theory and talk about it. And during one of our meetings, I witnessed a conversation between two of the women that changed how I saw this forever. One of the women was white and one was black. The white woman said, now this is the part that's going to sound really 25 years old now. The white woman said, all women have the same experience as women. All women face the same oppression as women. All women are similarly situated in patriarchy. And therefore, she said, all women have a kind of intuitive solidarity or sisterhood. The black woman said, I'm not so sure. Let me ask you a question. So the black woman says to the white woman, when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? And the white woman said, I see a woman. And the black woman said, you see, that's the problem. Because when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, she said, I see a black woman. To me, race is visible. But to you, it's invisible. You don't see it. And then she said something really startling. She said, that's how privilege works. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. It is a luxury, I would say, to the white people sitting in this room not to have to think about race every split second of your life. That's what privilege is about. Privilege is invisible to those who have it. Now, you'll remember I was the only man in this group. So when I witnessed this, I kind of put my head in my hand and groaned. And, oh, no. Somebody said, well, what was that reaction? And I said, well, when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I see a human being. I'm kind of the generic person. You know, I'm a middle-class white man. I have no race, no class, no gender. I'm universally generalizable. So I like to think that was the moment I became a middle-class white man. That class and race and gender were not about other people, but they were about me. I had to think about them. And it had been privileged that it kept them invisible to me for such a long time. Now, I'd love to tell you that that's the end of this story, but I was reminded of it just last semester. I have a colleague at Stony Brook where I teach, and she and I both teach the sociology of gender course. So when it's my turn to teach it, she always comes to give a guest lecture for me. When it's her turn, I go to give a guest lecture for her. So I go to give a guest lecture in her class, 300 students in the room. And as I walk in the door, one of the students looks up and says, "Oh, finally, an objective opinion." All that semester, every time my colleague opened her mouth, what my students saw and heard was a woman. Shirley, if you were to stand up in front of my students and say, there is structural inequality based on gender in the United States, they would say, well, of course you'd say that. You're a woman, you're biased. When I say it, they go, oh, that's interesting. Is that going to be on the test? How do you spell structural? So I want you to know, I hope you all in the back can see this. This is what objectivity looks like. Disembodied Western rationality. Here I.
So I'll just pause there because that's, I think, enough of that clip for now. And I played for this for my students as a way to get them to start to think about issues of race, class, and gender as being about them, as starting to look at their own privilege. But I like that he gave the example that comes from university teaching. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that from their own experiences. I think we know from work on course evaluation questionnaires that students tend to evaluate us very differently depending on our gender, race, class. So then in terms of thinking about our own biases, so what biases are we bringing to the classroom? I wanted to play you this clip. This is the one that I had last week from Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a social psychologist. And she introduces, I'm going to play part of this clip for you, and she's talking about facial recognition, and she's talking about the phenomenon that people tend to be able to distinguish between faces of people who they perceive as being from their own race better than faces of people who they perceive as being from another race. And she talks about the neurological reasons for that. So I'm going to play that clip for you. And then she talks about what that means for unconscious bias. And we'll talk about ways to check that unconscious bias. Start this part way through. So she has just started to talk about facial recognition.
Humans. So this highlighted area you see here is the brain's fusiform face area, or FFA, one of multiple places in the bottom back of the brain that helps us to distinguish faces. The FFA helps us to differentiate the familiar from the unfamiliar, the friend from the foe. And over the past few years, working with my team at Stanford University, we've shown that the FFA actually becomes more active. Its neurons firing more vigorously when people see faces of their own race. When they see faces from other races, though, the neurons are less active. So what's happening is this. Our experiences are actually tuning our neurons. Our brains are being wired by the people that we surround ourselves with. So it's not just in our minds. It's actually right there in our neural passages, the connections that make it possible for us to categorize familiar, unfamiliar, similar, different, us, them. And this process of categorization doesn't stop at simple identification. It extends to the beliefs and the feelings we attribute and assign to people with certain characteristics. Whether we like it or not, we all carry beliefs and feelings about all sorts of social groups, beliefs that influence our perceptions and our actions, even when we're not aware of it. This is the definition of unconscious bias. It's like the orchestra example Blessing told us about. Now check this out. Take a look at these images. Researchers have found that simply seeing images like this can intensify stereotypes. Seeing a picture of a male police officer, for example, makes you think that men should be police officers and that women should not be. And when our stereotypes are reinforced, even in that simple, subtle way, it can lead women to actually perform differently. For example, let's take another look at Joy. When Joy is subtly reminded of her gender identity before taking a challenging math test, her performance plummets. That's because in the US and in other countries, there exists a stereotype that women are not that good at math, right? Yet when Joy is prompted to think about herself as Asian, her performance rises on that very same math test, right? Same woman, same test, different outcome. That's how deeply ingrained these biases can be. And the thing is this, simply having knowledge of societal beliefs about our group can influence how we perform. We don't have to personally endorse those beliefs. We don't even have to live in a society where those beliefs first emerged. That's how powerful these unconscious biases are. When you think of a lawyer or president, do you think of a male or a female? What about someone cooking dinner over a hot stove? In your mind's eye, when you see a banker, what color is their skin? What about someone in jail? People often say, seeing is believing. But in many cases, believing is seeing. As we go through life, these kinds of connections get wired into our brains day after day, year after year, despite our intentions and without our permission. It's part of being human. It's how we sort and categorize the overload of stimuli that constantly bombard us at any given moment. It brings coherence to a chaotic world. So whether you like it or not, if you have a brain, you have bias. Bias isn't always bad or wrong. It actually helps us to decide to approach the house pet, but leave the wild animal alone. So that's a good thing, right? Yeah, bias, it's a marker of our history. It's a marker of where we've been and what we've seen. But left unchecked, unconscious bias can lead to great detriment for social groups and the world that we share. It can shackle us in place.
And so Dr. Eberhardt says, if you have a brain, you have bias. And this can be a way to start to talk to our students about the fact that we all have biases. We're bringing different kinds of biases into the classroom with us all the time. And what she says, as we talked about last week, is one of the most powerful ways to check our bias is to introduce friction, to ask ourselves why we're making the decisions we're making. So if we become aware that, for example, in a classroom of our students, it's going to be more difficult for some students than others to speak up. Some students are more used to being interrupted. We know that women students tend to get interrupted more than men. Some students are going to have to work harder to have their voices taken seriously. And then to acknowledge our role, the power that we bring as instructors in being seen as authority figures. and how does that interact with our students? And considering all of those things as we come into the classroom, and then helping students start to reflect on that themselves. I don't know if anyone here wants to share, before we get into some of the strategies that I have to suggest, any of the ways that you've tried to talk to your students about privilege and bias. I know this will be very introductory level for many of you who are coming from social work, but it's also newer for some others. So when we're thinking about what it means for a learning environment to be equitable, accessible, and inclusive, I didn't want to just keep us talking about individual biases. So it's important to think about the role that our own brains play in bringing bias to the classroom. But there are also structural barriers. We're talking about societal patterns of power and privilege that structure the lives and experiences of our students differently, and how that gets brought into the classroom. And so one of the most important ways to explore that is to listen to our students, to talk to them and see what they have to say. And so I've included a link for you to look at. This is just a screenshot of a panel I mentioned in our session last week called Teaching All Students, What Do Diverse Students Want You to Know? It's a panel we did for the Teaching and Learning Conference last April, with students from the Blunden Center, the Mon Disability Resource Center, the Internationalization Office, Trans Support NL, and the Indigenous Student Resource Center. And these are all representatives of those organizations who help other students, and they were very insightful in bringing forth some of the barriers that students are facing, and very specifically, what would they like their instructors to do? So I think you'll find that quite useful. So any questions before we move on to talking about some specific strategies? Are there any questions in the chat, Justina?
No, no questions.
Okay. So first of all, let's talk about strategies for establishing a sense of connection. Before students can feel safe and comfortable enough to learn, they need to feel connected in some way. Teaching and learning are about relationships. And so starting off, creating a sense of connection by telling students a little bit about yourself. And if you're reflecting, for example, on privilege and bias together in the classroom, it's one of the ways to start talking about our social location. So when I introduce myself, I let students know that I'm from white settler ancestry, that I'm from a small community here on the island of Dumguk, Newfoundland, that I'm queer, that I'm cisgender, and that gives them a sense of my social location, and can then start to introduce conversations about bias. In smaller classes, one of the things that a lot of faculty find useful is to invite students to meet with you at the beginning of the semester. And you can do that either individually or in small groups, to give them an opportunity to talk about anything that they're concerned about, accommodations they might need. And these might be informal accommodations as opposed to the official accommodations that we get notified for by the Blunden Center, any workload concerns they might have. And I have found that really useful. In terms of first connecting with students, but also finding out about barriers that I might not have foreseen that might be very easily addressed at the beginning of the semester. But if you don't find out something that a student is facing until the end of the semester, sometimes there's very little you can do. And then in larger classes, what I've done is survey students. I've simply used a survey tool in Brightspace to ask the students about their needs. I give them a 3 or 4 page, 3 or 4 question survey called What Do You Need? And I have found that an excellent way to get to know a large number of students at a time, and to make sure that I know any of the concerns that they might have just at the very beginning of the semester. And then what I do as I get the results of their survey is follow up with each one of them individually to see what kinds of accommodations or alternatives they might need, and make sure that their learning needs can be addressed. So any thoughts about those strategies or questions or experiences trying those things? And I'll move to this slide. I won't spend too much time here because we talked about this last week, but I think it's such an important part of establishing a connection is make sure that we're correctly identifying our students in a personal way. Connection means knowing students individually. And so making sure that you know the correct pronouns for your students. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to just share your own pronouns. And you can invite students to share their pronouns if they wish, although recognizing not all students might be comfortable doing that for any number of reasons. And then you can check with students individually to confirm the name that they want to be called, as well as correct pronunciation. I wouldn't do that in front of the class. That's something I would do individually. And a strategy that I have used in the past is to go through my class list when I first receive it. And if I don't recognize a name, many names can actually be Googled to check the pronunciation and at least get closer to correct. And then at least I have an idea to start from before I check individually with a student about the pronunciation. I don't know if anyone else here has any tricks or tips in terms of identifying students correctly that they want to share. All right, well, let's talk about remote connection because even though we've gone back to in-person classes, many of us still have a remote component to our courses. In terms of introducing yourself, you can do that on Brightspace simply by using sharing a bio, but adding something a little bit more personal, like a photo or even a video to introduce yourself. And one of the things that I have used quite a bit when I teach online, so students haven't met me and I won't meet students in an entirely online course, is to still meet them virtually by using a video note. So when I post announcements in the course shell, you can use a little tool that's just called Insert Stuff on Brightspace to add a video note that can be automatically closed captioned. So this could be, you know, introducing the course. You could do this every so often when you do an announcement to remind students about an assignment, whatever the case might be, but to include a video of you actually speaking to the students to remind them rather than just a text announcement. And I always include a transcript with that as well. The other thing that I have found really useful to connect with students in an online course is to do a weekly check-in with all of the students via email, where I remind them of assignments or tasks that need to be done, what the readings are for the week, check in perhaps about current events, just send that regular email every week to remind students that I'm there and to remind them about their progress in the course. And then in an entirely online course, you can encourage students to meet one another simply through the discussion forum in Brightspace if you create a forum for introductions. And you can ask different kinds of questions there to encourage informal connections. I know when I was working with Dr. Elsa Craig in sociology, we were teaching Introduction to Sociology together. They often asked questions like, what's your favorite color, or what's your favorite song, or if you look around right now, what's one beautiful thing that you can see? And those are ways to encourage students to connect on a more informal basis. I've included a link there in the slides. You can see on the bottom in pink, creating community in your remote course. That's a handout that we created, a PDF handout that we created at CITL last year for lots more ideas about how you can create connection and community even when you're teaching completely online or remote. So any questions or comments about those strategies? Are you aware of how to use the video notes in Brightspace?
Georgina here. I've used them, and actually, I just posted some video notes in my announcement sections, and I try to do it very informally versus like the videos of me like teaching online is like at my desk. I kind of go out on my patio or sit on my couch and kind of do it. But yeah, just it's normally just a little check-in.
Absolutely. That's what I do as well, and try to keep it a little bit informal because I do use it for, just very general announcements that I'm going to make throughout the semester. I think it makes a big difference for students as well, just to be able to see your face. And so I want to talk about strategies as well in terms of our overall classroom approach. And one of the interesting things that research shows is that having a warm approach with students, something that you convey in person, that you can also convey even through a syllabus, as we talked about last week, having a warm approach makes it more likely that students will actually share with you the difficulties that they're encountering, the barriers that they're coming across, and the accommodations that they might need. One of the things that can be useful at the very beginning of term is to have students work together to create a value statement for the course or a code of behavior expectations for the course. And then you can then include this collaboratively created statement in your syllabus. And so that students know what the expectations are and they've actually created those together. Another thing that you can do in the classroom, either online or in person, is just take a couple of minutes at the beginning of class to check in about student well-being. Make sure students know that you care about how they're doing, rather than just launching right into the material. You can also build in breaks, which is really important in both remote and in-person classrooms. When I'm teaching, I teach the graduate student program here, teaching skills enhancement program, and those classes are an hour and a half long. So I always give students a break partway through. And I think we're all realizing that video meetings like this need breaks just as much, if not more so, than in person. And one of the things that I learned through conversations with students I've had at the Blunden Center and through actually the representative who we had come and talk with us in the panel that I've included, is that some of the behaviors in class that traditionally have been considered problematic, and we might have been trained as educators to consider problematic, are actually really useful coping strategies for students. So some student behaviors such as fidgeting, or using different kinds of devices, those actually might be allowing students to learn. And so if it's something that's bothering you or something that you feel like you should cut down on, it's worth having an individual conversation with that student to see why they might be doing that particular thing. Does anyone have experience with that in their classroom?
So in terms of you mean the fidgeting behavior stuff? Is that
Yeah.
what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'm a bit fidgety, like constantly, right? So I think it helps that I acknowledge that. Like I acknowledge if I'm anxious, I acknowledge that with them, and then it might explain why I'm a bit more fidgety or restless than they would expect me to be. And I find it's sort of reciprocal that when I do that, students who might not normally talk because they're anxious will talk and say, I'm pretty anxious about this, but I'm going to give it a shot. Um, I've had some really good sort of experiences with acknowledging that type of need to fidget, or sort of be gulpy or whatever it is that students need to be when they're speaking. So
Thanks for that, Kathy. The other thing I was thinking about is on the other side of it. I don't know if you're all aware of, there's an excellent guide called Pulling Together. It's on indigenization of the curriculum and of teaching, created out of UBC, partnership out of UBC. And one of the points they made there is that sometimes when students are very quiet or don't respond when you're asking questions, it could be because they personally or culturally are really value listening and taking in information, and that the tendency is not to immediately snap back and have a response, that part of what they're valuing is really listening and taking in that information. And we're really trained, I think, to teach in a certain way, and to reward people who talk quite a bit and who respond very quickly. And so thinking about our own biases on that and how culturally that might not make sense for a lot of students is something that really struck me in reading that text. Any other thoughts or questions on classroom approach?
Yeah, hi, it's Laura. I really think it's important to have, a discussion around community guidelines and have students participate in that. I think it sets the tone for the semester. I'm wondering, and maybe this is a question or reflection for a larger conversation, but certainly in social work and in other departments, the notion of safety is incredibly important. And this means different things for different people based on different theoretical orientations. There can be intense conversations where we're, exploring power and privilege, and the whole, notion of safety definitely comes up. It comes up for students that, occupy intersecting social locations. And so I guess it's more of there can be sometimes tensions around safety and what professors or instructors do with that safety. So it's just it's a question that has come up, and for me, I certainly know how I navigate that. But I'm wondering if that's something that other people have struggled with or have explored.
Absolutely. I actually listened to a really interesting podcast the other day. It wasn't academic, but it was
Mm.
with a Black feminist activist named Loretta Ross,
Uh-huh.
who's a book called Calling In, Call Out Culture.
Right.
And she talks a lot about the term safety, and she's all about connecting with people and making sure that they are able to learn. But she was really questioning the term safety,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not always possible to feel safe, and we still need to learn in conditions where maybe we're learning about something that makes us feel a bit uncomfortable. And so for us, figuring out the line where each person um, needs to be able to say that when something has gone too far, maybe they're a little bit uncomfortable examining their own privilege,
Right.
but if something is truly triggering and upsetting for them, that's a whole nother level, and something we need to be, I think, very aware of as instructors.
Absolutely. And I think it's clearer if it's underpinned by a social justice orientation, in terms of where, because sometimes we do need to draw that line within classrooms. But it's definitely an ongoing conversation, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the other guides that I find really useful, and it'd be quite relevant to what you're talking about here, Laura, is called the Antiracist Discussion Pedagogy. I don't know if
I
you
don't
know this
know it.
particular resource. I have
Okay.
the link included here. I highly recommend it.
Wonderful.
And so that that guide focuses very much on specifically having students talk about anti-racism in class and how that works. But the advice there really is relevant for wider discussions about what does it mean to have an inclusive discussion, particularly when you're talking about difficult topics and topics where students are going to have very different relationships to the topic and to
Mhm.
power and privilege within that.
Mm.
And we also have our own particular relationship to power and privilege in that discussion. And so
Absolutely.
they really emphasize reflecting on your own values and your own social location before you talk with your students, as we talked about, and also thinking about where your students are located in terms of
Hmm.
power and privilege. Um,
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely look at that.
yeah, I find that really useful.
Thank you.
And they also talk about there exactly what Laura said, providing students with really clear communication guidelines or collaborating with them, the same way we talked about collaborating on the value statement, to develop a set of guidelines for the class. And then having a really clear plan for yourself ahead of time about how you will de-escalate conflict. He said, you know, when conflict happens and people are feeling a sense of fear and a sense of threat, that's not the moment to come up with a plan for how you're going to de-escalate conflict. So really thinking about ahead of time some of the issues that could come up, some of the things that might be controversial, and there might be issues, of course, that come up that surprise us, that end up being really heated, and figuring out how to de-escalate conflict. I don't know what your own experiences have been, but for me in teaching Intro to Gender Studies, we do bring up some topics that are really difficult for students. And at one point, I had a student who told me from day one that he was attending the class because he hated feminists and he didn't think that gender studies should be taught. He was a big fan of Trump. And it was a very challenging time having him in my class. And unfortunately, that situation actually escalated a little bit to the point that I had campus security on speed dial on my phone because he was becoming threatening. But there are all different kinds of conflicts, hopefully less extreme than that example that can come up in class. So really having a plan for that is so important. And in this guide, the Anti-Racist Discussion Pedagogy, they emphasize inquiry-based discussion. So for us to have a role as facilitators when we're instructors, to ask questions of students, to ask them to share more context about their statements, for us to provide context around power and privilege for some of the statements students might be making about their own experience, and gentle redirection as necessary. Any other thoughts or questions about inclusive discussions or about equity, accessibility, and inclusion in general in the learning environment? Turn my video back on so you can see me.
One of the things that I do right at the beginning of a class, that I can't take credit for it. It's a friend of mine who is a mental health worker introduced me to acceptance commitment therapy, and they something called a matrix, which is about values based, sort of, you know, what's going on for you inside and outside when you're moving towards your values, and what's going on for you inside and outside when you're moving away from those values. So it's really about mindfulness. And so she helped me to develop a group matrix thing that I use with my students. And what I really like about it is it does set sort of the guidelines, but it really focuses on me being mindful of myself in process versus what other people are doing. So it's not like it takes it away from that sort of corrective measure to more of a responsible measure for myself. So I think the other thing that I try to do is I give students permission to leave if they need to, right? Like, they know themselves best. You know, if something's really beyond where they're comfortable, they can leave with no questions asked. There, no drama, right? Like it's your right to sort of be in a space that feels as safe as possible for you. And when it starts to get outside of that space, feel free to go if that's what you want to do, right? So, but I really find that mindfulness piece is really helpful, you know, in terms of setting the mood in a classroom for people to sort of have responsibility for their own sense of where they are and safety.
That's really interesting, Kathy. I don't know if you have a name or a link for that particular model, but if you want to put it into the chat, that might be helpful.
Sure, I'll just put in, it's called an ACT matrix, and then you just modify it, but I can put that into the chat, no problem.
Thank you. That'll get recorded in so that we can look at it after. One of the things that I do similar to that in online teaching is whenever I'm sharing videos with students, and I tend to have students watch a lot of films, I'll give them a content warning. I'll tell them generally if there are upsetting topics, because we don't always know what might be upsetting for students. But I always give them the caveat that they know themselves for the best, as you said, Kathy. So if something is too upsetting for them and it's not going to enhance their learning experience, it's just going to be too upsetting, that they can decide for themselves if it's not worth it to watch that. And so they can let me know. I really try to build a lot of trust with students, and honor what they need. And so far that's worked quite well, even with larger classes. Has anyone else had experiences where strategies that they've tried for equity or accessibility have worked well or not so well? We're open to hearing both. I do know it's always a balance, that when I give students flexibility, I always try to give them flexibility, but within a certain structure and guide. If things are completely flexible, sometimes students can get a little bit lost. And I know in talking to neurodiverse students in particular, they've often really appreciated having some specific guidelines and then flexibility within that.
Kathy said, oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just put in the chat something that I was just introduced to is collaborative note taking, and I really love it. Just in terms of accessibility, where people take notes, and you in the case of the course I'm in, they have a discussion forum where you post the notes, and people can then avail of those things. And I think also for neurodiverse students, that can be really helpful as well. Just because everybody takes notes differently, right? So having access to other people's take on things, I think is something that, for me anyways, it's something I'm going to do with my courses for sure. And it also counts in this class I'm doing as part of your participation.
Oh, we lost your voice for a second, or at least I did, Kathy. Were you saying it counts as part of participation?
Yeah, so it's part of your, if you are put even just one note in over the course of the term, you'll get a participation grade for it as part of your participation. So
interesting. Okay, I've used collaborative note taking a bit, especially recently, because I find it quite useful. There's so many students who have to be at home now for so many reasons, or students who are not able to make it to a live session, even if it's online. And that's where I found collaborative note taking really useful. It has students work together and create those connections, and then it also makes the information that's shared in class more accessible.